Hello and welcome to Equip for Equality's first Facebook Live session about COVID-19 and return to work issues. I'm really honored to be here today talking about employment rights under the ADA with respect to COVID. I'm Rachel Weisberg. I'm an attorney with Equip for Equality, and I manage Equip for Equality's Employment Rights Helpline. And I'm here today with Hannah Walsh, who will introduce themselves later as well.
Thank you.
So a bit of a quick plug for Equip for Equality. Equip for Equality is the protection and advocacy system for the state of Illinois. Our mission is to advance the human and civil rights of people with disabilities. And we provide free legal assistance for people with disabilities about issues related to their disability. We do that through 3 different legal teams. We have a team that focuses on civil rights, which is what Hannah and I are part of. We have a team that does special education rights. And we also have a group that does abuse investigations. For folks who want to get in touch with us, our contact information is at the bottom of this slide, or you can look up equipforequality.org. What we really wanted to do today is highlight an initiative of Equip for Equality called the Employment Rights Helpline. This helpline is here to provide free legal advice and legal assistance for job seekers and employees with disabilities in Illinois. We do a whole lot of things in the helpline. We do everything from talking about employee rights under the ADA. We answer people's questions. Our real goal is to empower people to be able to advocate for themselves while we kind of stay behind the scenes. And so we'll do things like review reasonable accommodation forms, review communications back and forth with your employer, and really help folks be able to advocate effectively in the workplace. Another way we do that is help people understand their options. We have a number of comprehensive legal and practical fact sheets, including sample letters and forms. And of course, we give referrals and provide other assistance as needed. We're going to have our information for this at the end of this presentation as well. But if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always go to equipforequality.org/employment. Okay, so let's jump in. And I just want to acknowledge that this past year has been hard, right? It's been hard for all of us. And it's been particularly hard for people with disabilities in the workplace. A lot of that is because of all of these uncertainties and unknowns about the law, about COVID itself. And so what we're going to do today is think through some of the issues that we've been thinking about and working with and counseling people on over the past year. And we've come up with pretty much 4 commonly asked questions. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start, Hannah and I are going to give about a 30-minute presentation about what these answers to these 4 commonly asked questions. And then we're going to spend about 30 minutes answering your questions, hearing from you. So what we're going to do is talk about who's covered by the law. Then we're going to talk about some commonly asked questions about returning to work and what happens once you've returned to work and association discrimination. We'll spend some time going over resources, and then again, we've got 30 minutes today to talk about your questions. And so we're going to save all the questions for the end of the presentation, but if you have any questions at any time, you can email them to employment@equipforequality.org, or you can just type them right into the chat or the Facebook feed, and Hannah and I will be sure to answer as many as we possibly can within those 30 minutes. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Hannah to talk a little bit about the ADA.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah. I am a staff attorney at Equip for Equality, and I work with Rachel on the Employment Rights Helpline. So first, we wanted to get started with kind of an overview of the laws that apply to employees with disabilities in the COVID-19 pandemic. So the big law that most of you may have heard of is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. That's kind of be the law that we're focusing on here, but there are a lot of other laws that may apply. For example, there's another federal law called the Rehabilitation Act that covers federal government and federal government employees. There are state and local laws as well, such as the Illinois Human Rights Act, that may provide some additional protections. But starting with the ADA is a federal civil rights law. It's broken down into different sections called titles, and Title I is the section of the ADA that focuses on employment. And the ADA, this employment provision, applies to all private employers with 15 or more employees, as well as all public employers, such as state and local government. I just referenced the Illinois Human Rights Act. That law actually applies to all employers, regardless of number of employees. So if they have one employee, they're still covered. So there is some protection if, for whatever reason, your work situation doesn't fit into the parameters of the ADA. And so the purpose of the ADA in this Title I is that it protects people with disabilities as defined by the ADA. And we're going to get into what that means, what disability actually means under the ADA, and as well as some additional protections that it might have for people who are associated with people with disabilities. So if you have a family member who has a disability, the ADA may provide some protections for you in that situation as well. Okay, so a big question here that maybe a lot of people are asking is, I'm high risk if I contract COVID. Am I covered by the ADA? And the answer is maybe. The ADA does protect some people who are at high risk of serious complications due to COVID. However, as we know, there are different high risk categories, and for the ADA to provide protection, you have to have a disability under the law. So most people are going to fit into that definition of actual disability under the ADA, which is an individual who has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And that's kind of maybe a little bit of a complicated definition, it may seem, but it's really not as confusing as that. And the ADA is meant to be kind of as inclusive as many disabilities, medical conditions as possible. So essentially, a major life activity can be anything from walking, talking, breathing, your body's ability to regulate cell production. It's really broad. So, the focus is more on what your protections are after you've kind of established you have a disability. The ADA also provides protection to other categories of people who may not fit that actual disability definition. For example, individuals who have a record of or a history of an actual disability. An example of this would be possibly someone who had cancer but has now been in remission. A person in that circumstance may have some protections under the ADA, as well as someone who's regarded as or perceived to have a disability. And what that can mean is if for some reason your employer believes you have a disability, let's say diabetes, you don't actually, but they treat you adversely because of that, you may be protected by the ADA because your employer is regarding you as having that disability. Okay, so how do we know if we are considered high risk and protected by the ADA in this instance because of our mental health or medical condition or disability that would normally fit? So if your high risk status is because you have an underlying medical condition or impairment, then you are probably covered by the ADA. And we've provided some examples that the CDC has given, and it was updated as recently as December 23rd, 2020. So they're continuously updating this list. This list isn't necessarily inclusive. This is just based on kind of the research that's been done so far, the categories of conditions that may fit in, but the CDC guidelines kind of go beyond that and list a lot of other disabilities that might be considered an impairment that you're high risk for. So some examples of ones that the CDC has determined, yes, fit into that category as high risk are cancer, chronic kidney disease, COPD, Down syndrome was one of the recent additions as of December 2020. An immunocompromised state from a solid organ transplant, a serious heart condition, sickle cell disease, type 2 diabetes. And just because maybe your disability isn't on this list doesn't mean it doesn't fit in. Again, this is a growing list of disabilities, and the CDC also recognizes that other medical conditions may be a disability. And we provided a link at the bottom of this presentation if you want to check out those CDC guidelines and get more information for yourself from there. Okay, so as we've been talking about, you could be covered and protected by the ADA if you're considered high risk because of an underlying medical condition or impairment, right? However, there are other categories and populations of people that are considered high risk that may not be protected by the ADA. So for example, the CDC considers people 65 years old or older to be high risk for COVID, but they are not protected by the ADA simply because of their age. The same is true with individuals who are pregnant. While pregnancy-related impairments, so there are a number of medical conditions that can occur while pregnant, such as gestational diabetes, that could be an impairment under the ADA that may be considered high risk in of itself and offer you some protections, but pregnancy itself is not. One nice thing to know though, so if you're high risk and you're having some issues, and you potentially need accommodations, but you're not covered by the ADA because you don't have this additional underlying condition. The Illinois Human Rights Act, which is that state law we were talking about, actually requires certain accommodations for pregnant workers. So even though you may not get those accommodation rights under the ADA, you might still get them under the Illinois Human Rights Act. Another example would be obesity. It's considered individuals who are in the category of obese are considered high risk, but unfortunately most courts have held that obesity without a separate underlying condition is not in and of itself an impairment under the ADA. So you wouldn't necessarily get protection for your status as someone in that population. One tip though here is a lot of people who are 65 years or older or are pregnant or are obese or have some other high risk factor, such as individuals who smoke, may have additional underlying conditions, right, related to something occurring when they age or their pregnancy. So that's kind of what you want to focus on if you're considering trying to get accommodations under the ADA or you want protections under the ADA. I'm high risk because of these other categories, but am I also high risk because of this underlying condition? And that's where you get that ADA protection, ideally.
Great, thank you, Hannah. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is that there is a link to download this PowerPoint slide in the Facebook feed. So, you'll have access to the actual links and all of this information if you just click on that link. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of a better sense of whether or not the ADA protects us based on our high risk status, we wanted to move into another very commonly asked question. I'm sure this is why many of you are joining us today. And that question is, let's say you have a disability and it puts you at risk for severe complications. And you've managed for the past year or so because your workplace has either been closed or you've been working from home. But now the world is starting to reopen a little bit, schools are reopening, more things are reopening, and you're being asked to come back to work. So that's a big decision, right? And that's something we've been spending a lot of time talking through with people. So what we wanted to do today is talk about, well, what should you do in that situation? What are your options? And I'll start by saying no option is going to be perfect, right? There's a lot of different options out there and they have pros and cons, but we're not here today to give you a magical solution, but we wanted to give you at least a framework to consider what you should think through. Another kind of disclaimer caveat before we jump in is that remember, under the ADA, every situation is really unique. And that's because we as people with disabilities all have unique qualities, we have unique functional limitations, we all have different jobs, we all work for different employers. And so really everything is an individualized assessment. And Hannah and I and others at the helpline are very happy to have a conversation either through this Q&A or after about your particular situation. But again, here's some framework that we can use to think through these situations. So okay, so starting with option number one. So option number one is your workplace is reopening and you just go back to work. You don't ask for any formal accommodations, you just go back. And a lot of people might be thinking, well, how is that even possible? But for some people and in some situations, it really is. And the reason why is you think about what your work site might look like, right? Your work site might look a lot different because your employer is it may look a lot different from how it used to, because now after, months of us all dealing with COVID, maybe your employer is universally distributing PPE to people. And that's really all you would need to be able to do your job safely. Or think about what else is your workplace already doing to keep other employees safe. Maybe it's has a really large building, and so there's sufficient space between employees. Maybe you have a job where there's no direct conversations or communications between your clients or customers or patients or public. There's all sorts of reasons. And so I think instead of just assuming there's no way I can go back, it's a non-starter, have a conversation with your healthcare professional. Only you can really make that decision. But at least consider, is this something that I could do? Another factor is that there are a lot of us who are comfortable talking about our disability, and there are a lot of us that aren't. And so remember, if you want to ask for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, you do need to disclose your disability to your employer. And so depending on your comfort level of doing so, that might also be a reason you want to kind of opt into this option 1 category. Okay, so that's option 1. It'll help some people. It's certainly not going to help everybody. So option 2, and I'd say this is an option where we've been spending a lot of time talking to people, and that's the option of, okay, I can return to work and I can return to my old job, but I'm going to need a reasonable accommodation to do it. And of course, reasonable accommodations under the ADA are any reasonable adjustment to the way our work is done, how our workplace is structured, workplace policies, all to provide people with disabilities equal access to employment. So there's an infinite list of types of accommodations that are out there. Some common ones that we see for COVID-19 are things like providing personal protective equipment or PPE. Kind of as a side note, remember that even PPE itself maybe need to be accommodated for people with disabilities. Of course, people who work with people who are deaf or hard of hearing may want and may need to have a clear face mask to help facilitate communication. There may be people who can't wear regular or like latex gloves because of allergies, and so we have to consider non-latex gloves. And so even when we're thinking of accommodations, sometimes we need to think of an accommodation upon accommodation. Other common accommodations are things like changes to the physical workplace. Again, sometimes these are things that we may just be doing in terms of universal design and universal safety, but things like adding a space between workstations, creating a barrier with plexiglass or one-way aisles. And then another one that we've been talking to a lot of people about is this concept of job restructuring. So under the ADA, it's considered an accommodation to remove certain job tasks that aren't essential parts of your job. Under the ADA, it's never reasonable to remove an essential function, but if there's something that's a very minor part of your job and that could be removed, and that's the only thing that's requiring you to be on site or being able to perform a job within a non-social distance area, maybe it's reasonable to remove that. So, silly example, as a lawyer, when I'm in the office, oftentimes when I write a letter to a client, I'll go do my own mail. Well, if I'm thinking about what do I need to do to be at the office to work remotely right now, that is, doing mail on site would be a task that I typically do as a lawyer. However, it's not an essential part of my job. It's something that can be restructured, and that's something that we as an organization have done during COVID-19. And now we have someone who does all of our mail, so it enables the rest of us kind of not to have to go to the office to do it. So those are the types of creative thinking that we need to do about job restructuring. Of course, the big one that I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking about is the reasonable accommodation of telework. I personally think that the enhanced and expanded ability to telework is probably the COVID-19 silver lining for a lot of people, including people with disabilities. But a lot of people have asked, okay, well, I've been able to telework for the past 9 months. Can I keep doing it? And the answer to that is maybe. It depends. Our favorite ADA answer. Some of the questions you'd want to think about are, well, when you worked from home, were you able to perform all of the essential functions of your job? If so, you probably have a better argument that you should be able to continue to telework. Well, what about how did that teleworking impact others in your organization? Did it negatively impact them? Did it have a neutral impact? If it didn't have a huge impact, that's also going to be a positive possibility for allowing you to telework. But I guess I just want to flag that I think when a lot of organizations went remote, they did, a lot of people thought that this was going to be really short term. And so employers may have gone above and beyond and allowed people to remove certain essential functions of their job. And so I think just because you did it before doesn't necessarily mean that you absolutely have the right to do it moving forward. I think it's a big factor. It may help, but it's not an absolute. It's something we would need to talk about again to see, can you still do all the essential functions from your job at home? And we have a link to telework fact sheet that the helpline put together at the bottom of this slide as well. Okay, so we've decided we want to ask for reasonable accommodation. How do we do it? Well, the same principles of accommodations really apply both in this COVID world and outside of it. So our advice to you is that you as a person with a disability needs to request the reasonable accommodation. Please, please, please put that request in writing. Make it super obvious what you're asking for. Use the phrase reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Keep a copy or request. Under the law, you do not have to do any of those things, but I am telling you, as someone who's been counseling people on this for 15 years, it really saves everybody a whole lot of questions and headaches. Make it as obvious as possible, document it. Okay, what happens after you make the request? Well, then the employer initiates the interactive process. They can ask you for reasonable medical documentation. There's supposed to be a dialogue between you and your employer to talk about all possible options. There's this concept under the ADA that your employer does not have to provide you with your preferred accommodation. They need to provide you with an effective accommodation. So if something would work, even if it's not your first choice, under the law, that's probably enough. So what we encourage you to do is, if it's reasonable, try it. And then if it's not working, tell your employer why. And if something really isn't going to work for you, be very specific about why it's not going to work and why your preferred accommodation will work. Again, all things we're happy to talk to you about. If anyone's listening today who's an employer, remember that the ADA does not prevent you from doing more than the ADA requires, right? So we just talked about a lot of employers have been kind of going above and beyond and accommodating people given the unique circumstances of COVID. You can still do that. There's nothing that says you can't remove essential functions, especially given the temporary nature of some of this. And so I'd encourage you to think, well, it's probably better to do something I may not have to do for the next couple of months and able to keep an employee, not have to hire a new person. There's still a lot of cost savings and, of course, morale savings in there as well. And then a reminder to both employees and employers, the interactive process is an ongoing thing, needs change. It's important to continue to have that conversation. We have a link here to information about temporary accommodations. We're at the point now where a lot of us are already getting vaccines. Vaccines are there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And so it may be that somebody really only needs an accommodation for a couple of months. And so I'd encourage employees who are asking for something, explain that. Like, I know this is maybe a lot, but I'm only asking for it for 2 months until I get vaccinated. And that may be a good selling point to convince an employer that that's something that is possible to do. We also have a link at the bottom of this slide to a fact sheet about reasonable accommodations and asking for them and best strategies. Okay, so there are going to be some people that no matter what accommodations are out there are simply not going to be able to return to their old job. Their job requires in-face constant communication, and that's just not something that they're comfortable and able to do safely. So in that situation, we're moving on to option 3, which is the reasonable accommodation of reassignment. Reassignment is considered the accommodation of last resort because, of course, it's always best to find an accommodation for your current job. But reassignment can be a good option if there is no accommodation that's going to enable you to return to your current job. For reassignment, we want to make sure that there's a vacant position that exists because employers aren't required to create jobs. And of course, we need a vacant position that's going to actually help you, right? A position that's going to make it possible for you to return to work. You have to be qualified for the position. Your employer is not required to promote you, and you want to find a job that's not subject to a seniority system. So if you're in that category, our advice to you is to find a vacant position and then ask to be placed in it as a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. And again, those magic words. For those of us who are in Illinois, the law is that if you can identify a vacant position and it meets all those other qualifications, your employer is supposed to place you in it as an accommodation. The law is a bit different in some other places in the country, but here in Illinois, it's a pretty strong right. So it can be very, very useful for people. And again, given the temporary nature of COVID and the COVID pandemic, you could always request temporary reassignment, to something that we could reevaluate once you're vaccinated or once things have changed in our world. And we have a fact sheet about reassignment on this slide as well. Okay, well, even some, there are going to be some people that we go through all these options, and unfortunately, even reassignment's not going to be an option. And so if you're in that boat, our next best suggestion is to consider leave. And there are a whole different number of opportunities to think of where you might be eligible or entitled to leave. The first place I would start is your employer policies. Of course, some employers have policies with providing medical or personal leave. You can also consider whether you'd be eligible for leave under the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act. Unfortunately, that law expired last year, but it's voluntary for some employers up until March 31st of this year. Other options are considering traditional family medical leave, FMLA, which provides 12 weeks of unpaid but job protected leave if you or a family member are incapacitated for any reason. I'll caution that FMLA doesn't require employers to provide FMLA leave for the purpose solely of avoiding exposure. But if you have an underlying health condition that warrants it, then that can be a basis for requesting FMLA leave. And at this point in time, again, it might be a good option for folks who, again, have a vaccine. I kind of have a reasonable expectation that you'll be getting the vaccine within the next couple of months. And then I'd say the last option for leave is leave under the ADA. Under the ADA, leave is considered a reasonable accommodation, but there are some real limitations on how much leave needs to be provided. And again, here in Illinois, courts have limited that to a couple of weeks. So another limit that the ADA places on leave is that ADA accommodations are only available to employees with disabilities. They're not available to people whose family members have disabilities. And so if I need to take leave because of a disability that I have, I can ask for that as an accommodation under the ADA. But if my partner needs to take, if my partner is the one who has a disability, I cannot take an ADA leave to help him. I would have to look at other options like FMLA or employer benefits. And then finally, I'd say the worst of the options is if we're at the point where none of these other options are going to work, you may want to consider looking to see whether you'd be eligible for unemployment. We are not unemployment experts. There are a lot of really wonderful legal aid organizations out there that are offering helplines and have a lot of great information about unemployment insurance. So with that, I will turn it back to Hannah to talk about some questions of once we are returned to work.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so now that, Rachel's gone through all her options and theoretically you're back at work, there are some additional kind of protections and guidelines that the ADA provides that may kind of be a little bit different in the COVID pandemic. So we wanted to go over that for you. I mean, we're going to start, we're going to kind of base all this off of what the ADA is in the ADA and what it says and how it kind of works when we're not in a pandemic, and then kind of look into the little changes to how things can work because we're in a pandemic. So the general rule under the ADA is that employers can only ask employees for disability information or perform medical tests if it's job related and consistent with business necessity. So, outside of COVID, we're thinking of, did a person ask for accommodations? In that case, yes, maybe your employer can request disability related information. Are they noticing some safety issues that they're concerned might be related to a disability and it's like an objective observation? Maybe they can require some sort of fitness for duty test. But some kind of specific questions that we wanted to address during COVID-19 is, what can and can't employers do in this situation? So employers can ask employees if they're experiencing symptoms of COVID, such as a fever, chills, or coughs, that kind of inquiry would normally be a medical inquiry that would be, that is regulated by the ADA. But in this situation, because there is, it's such a potential threat to have someone with COVID in the environment, in the work environment, employers can ask these questions. They cannot ask employees unrelated medical questions. So the questions they can ask have to be strictly related to what the symptoms of COVID are. They can't start then asking you about, well, do you have other disabilities? Do you have other medical issues that we need to know about? It's strictly related to COVID-19 related symptoms. And they cannot only ask these questions of people with disabilities. So if your employer is going to ask people these questions, they have to ask everybody, regardless of their status as a person with a disability. So those were kind of inquiries that employers can make. Now moving over to medical exams, things are a little bit different now as well because of COVID-19. So employers can take employees' temperatures, which outside of a pandemic, that would be a medical exam that they would need some kind of reasonable belief that they could, there was going to be some risk if you're coming in with a fever. Obviously, we're in an environment now where there potentially could be that risk. So employers can do that. They can also administer COVID-19 tests. Per the EEOC, this is permitted because of the CDC's stated precautions to determine if someone's going to pose a direct threat, right? So administering these tests allows your employer to identify people with COVID, which is a direct threat to the safety of people, other employees in that workplace, clients, customers. So in this situation, they can administer COVID-19 tests, but they, again, cannot only perform these tests on people with disabilities. So if they're going to be administering tests, it has to be to everybody. They also cannot require an antibodies test. The EEOC in its guidance has determined that this is not job related and consistent with business necessity. While a COVID-19 test may be, an antibodies test is not. And one important thing I think we to remember, and maybe to help kind of ease some people's worry about these kind of tests and questions, is that all of this medical information has to be kept confidential per the ADA. So you have confidentiality rights regarding your medical information under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, now this is a big question we have gotten from a lot of people, and I'm sure it's still a big issue for a lot of people, is returning to work and your employer having a mask mandate, right? Common question we get: my employer requires all employees to wear a mask. I can't wear one because of my disability. Can I be excused under the ADA? And the answer is, once again, maybe. Generally, employers can require employees to wear masks if it's necessary to protect the health and safety of others. So your employer can have this mask mandate. They can have this mask policy. However, if you can't wear a mask because of your disability, your employer does need to consider some other things, right? Maybe is there an accommodation that's going to work for you in this situation? For example, is it actually necessary to protect the health and safety of others? Do you work in an isolated workspace? Are you teleworking, right? If you're teleworking, I mean, common sense would say the mask mandate doesn't apply, but those are kind of different situations. And then are there any accommodations that would enable you to keep working, such as teleworking potentially until, you could be vaccinated and there's enough vaccinations that masks aren't as necessary in that situation? Or can you potentially be moved to an isolated workspace? Are there measures that can be put in place to kind of separate you from everyone else while we are still in a situation where masks are really reducing the spread, still, that high risk and direct threat of it spreading in a workplace? So, it's not a perfect situation, but there may be some options for you. And then a kind of more complicated question, although similar and with a somewhat similar answer, is can my employer require me to get a vaccine? And the answer is can they have this policy? The answer is generally yes. Employers can have this kind of qualification standard, and they're able to impose safety-based requirements like vaccine requirements, like a kind of analogous situation would be employers requiring the flu shot potentially in a hospital. Those are some instances we've seen in the past before. But if this vaccine requirement is going to screen out employees with disabilities, that could be a potential problem. And the employer is going to have to consider, is it absolutely necessary for the safety of this workplace, right? So, for example, does this workplace maybe not have contact with the public and everyone else has been vaccinated in the office? Maybe that's a situation where it's not as big of a deal if you're not vaccinated, or, enough people are vaccinated. And then, are there any accommodations that could mitigate this risk? Could you potentially telework until enough people are vaccinated, or could you potentially be reassigned to a position that allows for telework or allows you to be more isolated? Are there additional PPE things that could be put on, that can be given to the person who can't be vaccinated? Those are questions that we have to ask, because we do know that there are some people with disabilities that do have a high risk of something going wrong if they get the vaccine. So you kind of generally look at it like everything we've been talking about. Like, yes, we know it's important for employers to kind of implement these measures for the health and safety of their workers and the public, but you as a person with a disability, if it's preventing you from working, you may have some additional rights. You may have some reasonable accommodation rights, and your employer may have to, maybe put a little bit more thought and effort into working with you to try and make this work so that you can stay employed. And then finally, I think I referenced this in the very beginning and we're coming back to it now. So the ADA, as we talked about, has some protection for being associated with people with disabilities. So again, such as having family members who have disabilities. So a common question we get is, I don't have a disability, but my child does, and they're at increased risk for serious complications if they get COVID. Does the ADA help me out? Unfortunately, in terms of reasonable accommodation rights, and maybe your ability to ask to telework because of your child, that doesn't apply here. The ADA accommodation requirements only apply to the person with the disability. So they would only apply to you, and you would only be able to receive their benefits if you yourself had the disability. However, the kind of general ADA non-discrimination principles do still apply. For example, if other employees are offered to telework or take leave for really any other reason, or arbitrary reasons, or no reason, and then for some reason, decide not to let you do that for your child with the disability, you're being treated differently because of your association or your relation to that person with a disability, and that would be considered discrimination under the ADA. So you would get protection to that end. But I think for people in this situation who have children who have disabilities or family members who have disabilities, while you may not be able to get accommodations under the ADA, there are some other laws such as FMLA and options that kind of Rachel touched on that you may be able to utilize to at least, get some job protected leave or something else like that, so you can take care of your family member and not risk them. But unfortunately, the ADA does not apply in that situation. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel, who's going to give you some resources that are extremely helpful.
Thanks. Sorry, my computer did not want to unmute me. So there are a ton of really very valuable resources out there about COVID-19 and our rights. We have undoubtedly missed some, but here are a handful. There's a really helpful document from the EEOC that's continually updated as we learn more and as new issues arise. The Job Accommodation Network is a fantastic resource. We have a link here to their website all about COVID-19. The ADA National Network has a website, again, devoted to COVID-19, and then a subsection devoted to employment issues. Of course, the CDC, and then we have a link to a fact sheet that Hannah and I and our team have developed about COVID-19 and return to work issues, which might look pretty similar to our discussion today, but in a fact sheet form. So hopefully that's useful. So that takes us to the end of the portion where we talk and answer commonly asked questions. And now we're really excited to hear from you and hear your questions. One final thing before we shut down this PowerPoint and start chatting with you is that we do really love feedback. It helps us with our trainings. And so we're going to put a link in the Facebook feed. There's also a link to a survey in this PowerPoint. We would really appreciate it if you could fill that out. And then, of course, we have the helpline's contact information. If for some reason we don't get your question answered today, or you don't feel comfortable asking your question, please, please, please reach out to us. We are here to provide you with free legal assistance, and we want to support you however we can. So let's chat. Okay, so we have a couple questions that have come in so far. So let's get started. One question that came in was somebody who asked that they have asthma, and asthma is not on that CDC list that Hannah had gone over earlier. So the question was, does that mean that the ADA doesn't apply to his situation? So I guess I'll let Hannah start with that, but I just want to make sure that we're clear. So what the CDC guideline says is there's essentially two different categories. One category are people who have impairments that absolutely have an increased risk due to COVID. And then the CDC has a secondary list that, most likely have increased risk due to COVID. So from my perspective, at least, it kind of doesn't matter which list you're on. We just wanted to give some examples to be illustrative, but certainly if you have a condition that falls within any of those categories and your doctor has said you're at an increased risk, that should be sufficient under the ADA to essentially say that my high risk status is due to an impairment, and that impairment is recognized by the ADA. I don't know, Hannah, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, no, I would just agree with you, and I'm sorry for any background noise. My dog just woke up and is playing around. But I would just say, again, that list that the CDC has put out is not, fully determinative of whether or not you are a person with a disability who's in that high risk category. It really just depends on how your asthma impacts you, kind of how high that risk is. And if you are able, if you have a doctor supporting you and saying, yes, it is, the risk is just too high in this situation, I think that asthma could potentially easily fit into the category of high risk that would be covered by the ADA.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of asthma, one thing that we wanted to share, and people may have questions about, are whether or not there's actually been court cases about COVID-19 in the workplace yet. And given how ADA cases come in, they have to go through the EOC process, which takes a little bit of time. So far there haven't been, I'd say, I'm only aware of one case. I'll put it that way. I've only been aware of one case that has come in that's looked at how the ADA applies in the world of COVID. And it's actually on behalf of an employee who has asthma. And what happened in their situation is that they were a manager. They had been working remotely for a number of months due to COVID. And then the employer did something that we see that happens a lot. The employer just said, hey, everyone needs to come back to work. All managers need to come back to work. And they didn't do that type of individualized look. And this employee said, hey, by the way, I have asthma, I'm at an increased risk, and I'm very fearful of coming back. My doctor says I shouldn't come back. And the employer said, no, everyone needs to come back. This employee ended up coming back. A few other things happened in the meantime, but ultimately this individual did file a lawsuit under the ADA and also, I believe, Massachusetts state law. And a court actually granted what's called a preliminary injunction, and the court ordered the employer to provide the reasonable accommodation of telework for this individual. So a really interesting case. The case is called Peoples. It's out of Massachusetts. So I think we're expecting to see a lot more cases come out, but this is one that, the one that I've seen so far. We have another question from my good buddy, Allison. Allison asks so the EEOC COVID-19 guidance seems to suggest that somebody can be excluded from the workplace if they're unable to be vaccinated under a qualification standard analysis. as you touched on, even if they are COVID free? Are there other examples where someone with no illness has been excluded? Allison, that's a really great question. If you have any guidance or answers from your own expertise that you'd like to share, please feel free to add that to the chat. I mean, to me, it seems, and again, this is kind of my initial reaction, is that this seems to be like a pretty, not extreme, but it seems to be like, because of the nature of COVID and because of the direct threat that COVID imposes, we're kind of making some sort of statements about kind of excluding people from the workplace that we wouldn't necessarily be excluding under other situations.
Rachel, we have a question in the chat asking if there is any guidance about requiring or asking about the vaccination status of people in this particular situation, people that this organization supports. And I think, employers are allowed generally to have these vaccination requirements for work, as we kind of talked about before. So, asking the status of someone being vaccinated is likely also okay. The issue comes in at this point, the issue kind of then comes into play if that person can't get a vaccine, then what's going to happen? Like, is the employer automatically going to exclude them from the workforce? That's, likely not under the ADA the right move for that employer. They would then have an obligation to figure out, are there accommodations that can be put in place, at least temporarily, until enough people are vaccinated, or it's, the risk isn't deemed as high.
When COVID first started, a lot of us in the ADA world were trying to wrap our head around, let's take these traditional ADA principles that we all know and we talk about every day and apply them to kind of these new questions with COVID. And it was, a challenge. And I think a year in, we have wrapped our head around a lot of these concepts. And I think we're still kind of on the early edge of vaccinations and trying to figure out what this is going to look like, how it's going to play out. I do want to reference a couple of additional resources for vaccinations. One is that the Great Lakes ADA Center hosts wonderful ADA audio conferences. And I believe the next one coming up is all about vaccinations. It may not be specifically about vaccinations in the workplace, it may be about vaccinations generally, but for folks who are really interested in digging in deeper about vaccinations, that might be a good place to go and a good option. The other thing is that the EEOC resource that we had in the resource sheet has what the EEOC has been doing essentially is every couple of months as COVID has gone on, they've been adding additional questions as more issues have come up. And so for a long time, we didn't see anything about vaccinations because vaccinations weren't really something we all thought was on the horizon. Now that vaccinations are happening, the EEOC back in December did, or maybe it was even more recently than that, they did update their guidance document all about vaccinations. And it is a lot of what Allison said and what Hannah talked about in the presentation, but that might also be a good place for folks to go and to read a little bit more carefully. The way that and Robin from the Great Lakes ADA Center just put a link in the chat about how to register for the vaccination webinar. So that's great. The way that I personally read the EEOC guidance is they kind of frame it as this qualification standard. So they say, if we're it's okay to have these types of safety qualification standards, but if they're going to screen out people with disabilities, we need to analyze whether they truly are job related and consistent with business necessity. And we need to figure out if there's some sort of accommodation. So the easy situation is if somebody is unable to get vaccinated, they can telework, or maybe they can have job restructuring, or all the things that we're currently thinking of. I think the trickier thing, which I don't necessarily have the answer to today, but I think is something that we'll be thinking about is there going to be a point where at some point it might not be job related and consistent with business necessity? What happens if we have 100 people in our workplace, 99 of them are vaccinated? Is it okay that we don't have this one person? And it might be at some point that the answer is yes. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's the analysis that the EEOC is kind of trying to get at. Okay, another question that came in from the emails here. One question that someone asked is that and this is actually something that I've talked to a couple of clients about recently, that they really are eager to go back to work, but they've heard kind of through the grapevine, talking to other colleagues, that like people are just not wearing masks at work and their employers not really enforcing it, and that they're really fearful to go back. Hannah, you want to take that one? Any advice that you might give that employee?
I've also gotten a lot of these calls, unfortunately. And, obviously that is a potential big risk, even if companies do have these mask mandates, they're maybe not always enforced. I've seen kind of more issues with the employers not necessarily enforcing it with customers as much, depending on the situation, or, clients that are coming in. And what I would initially, I think, encourage people to do is, if your employer is providing accommodations in your workplace, and it seems like generally those accommodations are going to make you safe, right? You have maybe an isolated workspace, or you have enough PPE that you are safe, to potentially give it a try, because we don't know, things are different when we were working back in March than they are in this March. So, it could be that things have really changed around the office. So, I think if the risk isn't too high for you to try this, to give it a shot, but if you're observing that people are not wearing masks, that is, that's obviously a big issue that I think you should likely kind of report to HR and your supervisor, and let them know that probably initially at the gate, you're worried that people aren't going to be wearing masks, and let them know this concern. And if that's not happening, make sure that they're aware of it. And if it continues to happen, I think at that point, maybe the conversation changes. You start talking about, maybe, is there an actual telework option, since they're not able to keep the environment safe? But that is a tricky question that I don't know that there's a perfect answer to.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of what Hannah said. The other thing I'll just add is that, everything with the ADA really encourages us to be open and have these open conversations with our employers. And I think this is just a really good example of this kind of interactive dialogue that we want to have. Like, look, I'll go back. I want to go back, but here's my fear. What are you going to do to help kind of alleviate my fear? How are you going to enforce your mask-free policies? And what should I do? And have that conversation ahead of time. If I go back, I see that people aren't wearing masks. How do you want me to respond to that, so that you don't go back, start, getting really nervous because all these people aren't wearing masks? But, having that conversation in advance with your employer. Should I document it? Should I give you names? What should I do? And then that way you're at least kind of have an agreement with your employer about what to do if you encounter that situation, which hopefully you wouldn't. Okay.
I don't know that I see any more questions in the chat.
Just checking to see if we got another by email. I don't see one. One thing I'll just add, we've made a couple of references today about Illinois specific law, and about what Hannah and I do with the Employment Rights Helpline. We at Equip for Equality provide free legal assistance to folks who are in Illinois. If you are outside of Illinois and you're looking for guidance, a couple different places I would want to refer you. One is, you can always contact our sister agencies in other states. So Equip for Equality is a protection and advocacy agency for the state of Illinois. We're part of a national umbrella organization called NDRN, the National Disability Rights Network. So whatever state you're in, there is a P&A, as we call them, by you. Not all do a ton of employment work, but they're going to be places that will be able to answer some questions and at least get you to some other resources. Another great resource is the ADA National Network. If you look up the ADA National Network, you'll also be filtered to one of the regional locations, and they can also put you in touch, either answer your questions or put you in touch with folks who are more localized, who can advise you, give you some additional advice. So we're coming up at the end of the hour. I don't see any other questions. Hannah, do you see anything else?
No, I don't see anything else.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all so much. This was a big experiment for us to do our first Facebook Live training. It's been fun, and y'all have asked some good questions. And, I think this is the beginning of a conversation about some of these issues, like the vaccination question. But if anyone has additional questions, you can absolutely always reach out to me. You can always reach out to Hannah, always reach out to the Employment Rights Helpline. As I mentioned before, we do really value feedback, and we just put a link in in the comments with a SurveyMonkey survey. We would love it if you could fill it out. And we hope you have a wonderful evening, and thanks again for your participation tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone.